this Biden book. The excerpts are coming out. The book, I'm going to have Jake Tapper on pretty soon, who's co-author with Alex Thompson of this book about that is about the Biden cover-up. Was it a cover-up? Were there people inside the West Wing not telling the truth, or being disingenuous when people like myself would inquire about why Biden couldn't do this event or that event, or was afraid of doing a Super Bowl interview? All of those things, that we all saw with our own eyes, that he clearly, there was something afoot. But of course, you're only as good as your actual sourcing there. And it's pretty clear a bunch of aides did their best to prevent people from knowing any truths, right? Keeping cabinet secretaries away from him, keeping Biden away. But there's something, as much as I think it's terrible that the Bidens are once again trying to come out and defend themselves, putting themselves before the party, they ought to take a page from George W. Bush, right? After Obama won, after it was clear the Bush brand was done inside the Republican Party, he didn't go out there to try to fight for his legacy. He went and took up painting, right? And in many ways, by not trying to be out there engaging every day in his legacy, and thanks to Donald Trump, his legacy is oddly improved in the minds of many voters, certainly his personal legacy. There's still a lot of people who question whether, the greatest mistake made since Vietnam was the Iraq War. And I don't think anybody that isn't going to change. But certainly his character, and is in his sort of how he treated the institution of the presidency is something that has only grown with time. And not trying to make people uncomfortable by coming back out to defend himself and to say, no, my unpopularity is wrong, et cetera, et cetera. So I do think that the Bidens ought to but I get human nature wanting to defend yourself. But there's something about these books where you're going to have all these people make anonymous claims that, well, they were hiding it, or they were doing this, or they were doing that. Well, then shame on you. You own this. If you believe the country is at risk of slipping in the democracy, shame on you. And all of these anonymous aides, and frankly, all the people that worked for him that are now, they tell us, this is one of those, I think it's Brian Curtis over at The Ringer dubs these stories in the sports world, right? Every time somebody gets traded, you're like, oh, there's something. And then like right after the person gets traded, then all of a sudden the beat writer for said team writes the big tell-all story about how the relationship between player X and the ownership totally broke down. And he calls it a now they tell us. And this is a now they tell us, right? So now all these Biden aides who didn't say a word for 2.5 years are suddenly now speaking anonymously to folks. It is, or early aides coming out. Where were you at the time when many of us were pointing out he seems to be too old to be running for president? I know I did it quite a bit publicly. You had people like David Ignatius. And you know what many of those same aides did who are now talking to these authors? They would push back privately and publicly with me and others and say, no, it's fine. No, my interactions with them are fine. This is just exaggeration. You're buying into a right-wing narrative. So, these people have talked about both sides of their mouth. So I in many ways, I think this Biden book is only going to not just undermine Biden, but I think make it toxic for anybody that worked for Biden. Because then it becomes, where were you? How did you participate in the cover-up? Pete Buttigieg, this may mean something for you. You were a cabinet secretary. Are you going to now tell us, yeah, I didn't have much interaction with him? Well, then why didn't you say something? I had a cabinet secretary tell me that. They had no interaction with him and wondered about that. I had that off the record. After Biden quit, I've since shared it with people. I'm still not going to share who the cabinet secretary was because that's not I'm trying, I believe in keeping your word as a journalist, and it was an off the record as far as it being told to me. And I think it's up to that person to decide whether to speak out or not. But I think it's a question, anybody who worked directly for Biden. So Gina Raimondo, if she thinks about running for president, Pete Buttigieg, all of these cabinet secretaries are now going to have to answer for all of this. And I do wonder if it's going to make anybody that touches Biden persona non grata, not just anybody directly in the Biden world, as far as, the generation that lived through this mess will have to go away before they maybe get a second chance at the historical record. A lot of it, though, is going to depend on what the Trump presidency looks like 3 years from now and what kind of impact it has. Because everybody who worked for Biden and Joe Biden himself to me, is directly responsible for everything Trump does in the second term, right? Their behavior and their actions led us to this place. They're contributors to the place we are at. So they better hope it's a successful second term for Trump, because they will own a piece of that failure too. And the recovery for America from its what could be an economic disaster. I mean, obviously we're escaping short-term problems here by this pause with China, but let's be honest, already his management of the economy has cost a lot of people money, and it is still going to create inflation. So it is now, he's already done damage. The question is, can he mitigate the damage he's done, or is more coming? He's just delayed when that happens. But mark my words, if you're not happy with any part of the second term and you're angry, some of that anger belongs to the Bidens, and some of that anger belongs to the people who had no guts to speak out when it mattered and waited till talking to an author of a book. Finally, there's the story of the DNC and this issue of David Hogg, who, of course, was an activist born out of the Parkland shooting in Florida. I'll be honest, it's very personal to myself. I have my own connections to somebody who was in that school when it happened. So I have a lot of personal empathy for anybody that went through that. I think the way David Hogg has conducted his politics is hard to see him as a member of the leadership of the DNC, considering what the role of the DNC is. Now, there's obviously people that are unhappy with him that as vice chair of the DNC, he got elected vice chair of DNC, that he now wants to work with a group to primary essentially Democratic incumbents in very blue areas who he believes are stagnant, right? Who need generational change and all of this. This has created an uproar that a member of the DNC leadership is talking about primarying elected Democrats. And I understand that criticism. It's like, wait a minute, you can work on the outside. You chose to work on the inside. When you choose to work on the inside, you're choosing to work with the Democrats that have been elected and help new Democrats get elected, not necessarily purge the party from the inside. So I have empathy for the criticism of Hogg. But now they're trying to create so apparently now they've come up with instead of forcing the situation about, okay, you've got to make a decision, David Hogg, are you going to work on the outside or work on the inside? They've come up with a convoluted, it feels like a Politburo decision. Well, we've got to figure out how to get rid of this person, but we don't want to make it look like it's politics. We want to make it look like it's a technicality. So in this case, there was a challenge. There's supposed to be gender equity in the leadership of the DNC. Well, when the DNC chair won, and it turned out to be a man, not a woman, it should have triggered that one of the vice chair that there was going to be gender equity on the vice chair level, and there was not. So there's been a complaint filed. So now the DNC has decided they have to redo this vice chair race. So all they've done is and David Hogg has said, well, this is really about them being angry at me. They're just using this technicality to force a new vote. Malcolm Kenyatta, who was the other person elected vice chair, clearly doesn't like that he's been attached to the David Hogg controversy. He's upset about this. Let me just tell you something. I think the DNC looks ridiculous right now. Just effing ridiculous. It's behaving like a Politburo and not like an actual functioning political party in a democracy. A Politburo would come up with a convoluted technicality to purge somebody from the leadership because it's making other people unhappy, rather than actually dealing with the issue straight up front. So what they've done is they're actually going to make a martyr of Hogg. Like I said, I'm not sitting here. I don't think what Hogg was doing was I thought it was poor form. I thought it was in bad taste, right? To be elected a member of the leadership and then work to sort of purge Democrats. But I also think the way this entire episode is being treated, how the chair is dealing with this, how it's turned into this backroom thing, only makes the whole party look even less organized than we all thought they were. Clearly, there's a leadership vacuum. This has not been a good start for the new DNC chair, Ken Martin. I could tell you there's quite a few Democrats I hear from who are wondering why the chair of the Wisconsin party, Ben Wickler, who now is leaving there, who's had a ton of success, why he wasn't elected chair, and openly wondering would he be allowed this mess to go on. And I think for whatever reason, Ken Martin is not taking a strong hand on this. Feels like he's almost letting insiders get involved too much on this. Either way, it looks ridiculous. It's going to make a martyr out of David Hogg. And either he's elected again, which is, talk about major, with everybody knowing this, giant amounts of egg on their faces, or they don't, and it looks like a bizarre party purge, and all you've done is thrown fuel at the fire of the insurgent class wanting to get rid of the establishment. So it is one of those massively unforced errors, and leave it to the DNC to somehow get in its own way while they have this target-rich environment in what has been a sort of incompetence on the Trump administration, whether it's in government cutting, managing the economy, or all these very shady deals that seem to be taking place in the new crypto capital of the world, in the Arabian Peninsula there. And yet it's the Democrats shooting at each other, just making a mockery, frankly, of their own party here, and just they're going hog wild in all the wrong ways.